You fool! Warren is dead. The Closed Door and Others. 3 Weird Tales by Harold Ward. The Closed Door. Dying, Obie Marsh cursed his wife as he had cursed her every day of their wedded life. "You've poisoned me," he gasped, writhing in agony. "Yes, you've poisoned me, you she-devil." Lucinda, his wife, nodded dully. "Yes, I poisoned you," she answered without emotion. "You were going to die anyway. The doctor said so. It's just a matter of time, maybe years, maybe months. And I can't stand this fighting any longer. 15 years of it. 15 years of hell." "Damn you!" Marsh snarled through his clenched teeth, his bearded face twitching as a spasm of pain shot through his vitals. "We should have never got married," the woman went on quietly. "I never loved you, and you never loved me. 'Twas a case of your folks and my folks sticking in between us and the ones we loved. You've always hated me because of Lizzie Roper, and God knows I wanted to marry Al Sides. Just because they wanted the farm's join, they made us get married, me and you. Now we can't get a divorce because of the church, and I've just got sick of it all, Obie. Sick of it all." "You hellion," he gasped, his body twitching spasmodically. "I got the idea of poisoning you when you first took sick," she went on in the same even tone. "Old Doc Plummer said that you might linger along for years, and I just couldn't stand it, Obie. I just couldn't stand it any longer, your constant bullying and running over me." "You'll hang for it," Marsh said huskily. "I hope they torture you in hell." "Probably they will," Lucinda Marsh answered without emotion. "But it's worth it to have a little peace here on Earth. It hasn't been any heaven living with you." Marsh twisted convulsively, his gnarled fingers closing and unclosing, his thick lips drooling. He pulled himself together with a mighty effort. He was a hard man and strong. Hard men are difficult to kill. "I'll come back from the grave, you hussy," he gasped. "'Twould be like you," his wife answered. "Waiting for you," he went on, trying to shake his fist in the woman's face. The effort was too great. He dropped back upon the pillow again, the sweat standing out on his forehead in beads, his body shaking with spasms. "God, it hurts," he whispered. "Just like a knife." The woman suddenly lifted her head. She was listening. "Somebody coming," she muttered, moving swiftly to the window. A roadster was entering the lane. "It's old Doc Plummer," she said, half to herself, half to the dying man. "The old fool's earlier than usual, and you can still talk." The man on the bed quivered, his fists clenched and his muscles tensed as he tried to drag himself back from the yawning pit that awaited him. "Getting dark." "Doc's liable to recognize the symptoms," the woman went on as she heard the car come to a stop in the front yard. A sheet had been thrown carelessly across the foot of the bed. Seizing it, she wadded it into a bundle and pressed it against the face of the dying man. He fought against the stoppage of his breath with a feeble effort. She threw her whole strength against him. Suddenly his limbs straightened jerkily. She knew that he was dead. She sat up with a sigh of relief. The outside screen door slammed shut. Leaping to her feet, she threw the sheet across the back of a chair and turned to meet the doctor. "He just passed away in one of those spells," she said without emotion. "Come on him all of a sudden. Both the kids were at school, and I didn't have nobody to send for you. 'Tain't no use to say I'm sorry, for I'm not. I'm glad he's dead." The physician shook his head sympathetically. Like all country practitioners, he was conversant with the family affairs of his patients. For a moment he stood looking down at the still form of Obie Marsh. Then he pulled a sheet over it and turned to the woman. "Better sit down and take things easy, Mrs. Marsh," he said, following her into the other room. "I'll notify the undertaker and stop at the school and have the teacher send Mary and Jimmy home. Anybody else you want?" She shook her head negatively. "Tell Bill Reynolds to come prepared to take the body back with him," she said slowly. "This is my house now. Mine. That's the way my pap and his pap fixed up the deeds. And the quicker I get him out of my sight, the better it'll suit me. I never want to see him again till the day of the funeral, and I wouldn't tend that if it wasn't that people would talk. He made life hell for me," she went on bitterly. "I've hated him from the day I married him. It's my house now, and I'm going to lock that room as soon as they take him away. I never want to see the inside of it again. There's too many memories hovering around it. I'd burn it to the ground if it wasn't for burning the rest of the house." She dropped into a rocking chair and gazed at the doctor, her gaunt body quivering with unshed tears. The physician patted her on the shoulder sympathetically. "You're overwrought, Lucinda," he said kindly. "Overwrought and nervous. I'll fix up a tonic and bring it over tonight." "I don't need no tonic," she responded. "Knowing he's dead'll be tonic enough for me." The physician wagged his head solemnly. "Let's not speak ill of the dead," he said. "Everybody knows how he treated you. If there's nothing else I can do, I'll be getting along." In due time, the undertaker and his assistant came with their narrow wicker basket. Lucinda Marsh stood beside the door and waited for them as they carried their burden out. They looked at her queerly as she turned the key in the lock, then, removing it, placed it in her pocket. "I hope to God I never see the inside of that room till my dying day," she said. Bill Reynolds, the undertaker, shook his head in agreement. He too knew the life that she had led with Obie Marsh. The passing years brought little change in the outward appearance of Lucinda Marsh. Gaunt, hard-featured, tight-lipped, and unemotional, she moved about the farm as of yore, doing a man's work in the field, adding to the dollars that were already in the bank, conducting her business along the lines to which she had been trained. She had never had friends. Obie Marsh had seen to that. She made none now. Her children grew to manhood and womanhood. Little Mary married and moved to the adjoining township. Lucinda made no complaint and no comment. Jimmy took the place of the hired man, lifting a bit of the burden of labor from his mother's shoulders. But she still held the reins of management. Then he too married and brought his wife to the big, gloomy old house at the end of the lane. Children came, 6 in quick succession. If their happy laughter wrought any change in the heart of the grim, silent old woman, she never showed it. Emma, Jimmy's wife, busy rearing her brood, was content to remain in the background. Lucinda Marsh was still mistress of the house. Through all the years, that one room just off from the parlor, Father's room they called it, remained closed, the key hidden away in Lucinda's bureau drawer. It was never mentioned in the family circle. The children knew that there was some horrible taboo that kept it from being talked about. Their childish imaginations did the rest. They passed it with bated breath. When darkness fell and shadows hovered outside the circle made by the big kerosene lamp on the center table, they always played on the other side of the room, casting furtive glances toward the dark panels behind which lurked they knew not what. Then, with the passing of the years, came the hard times. First the grasshoppers destroyed the crops. Then came the drought. Prices went up, wages dropped, factories closed. Mary was the first to feel the blow. The bank foreclosed on her husband's farm. Then came illness and another baby. Finally, she was forced to come home with her sick husband and her little brood. Lucinda Marsh, as unemotional as ever, made room for them. Jimmy's wife's brother lost his place in the city. Destitute, he appealed to his sister. She told her troubles to Lucinda Marsh. 4 more won't make no difference at the table, the old woman said grimly. Write and tell 'em we'll make room for 'em somehow. Goodness knows, though, where we'll sleep 'em. They were sitting at the supper table when this conversation took place. It was Mary who, with a quick glance at her brother, ventured to speak that which was in all of their minds. Father's room, she said timidly. Couldn't we open that up and air it before they come and let 'em sleep in there? For a moment there was an awed silence. Lucinda Marsh turned her sunken eyes on her daughter, then glanced at the faces of the others. I vowed that I'd never set foot in that room till my dying day, she said finally. But they wouldn't be you, Mother, Mary argued. And we're cramped for room right now. Where else can we sleep 'em? Lucinda Marsh quietly laid down her knife and fork, her thin lips set in a straight, grim line. If anybody sleeps in that room, it will be me, she said finally. I lived with your father for 15 years, hating him every day more and more, and he hated me worse than I hated him, if such a thing is possible. The room's filled with our hatred. It's locked up in there, smouldering and ready to be fanned into flame again. But, Mother... Lucinda Marsh straightened her bent old shoulders with a gesture of finality. I'll move into it, she said grimly. I wish that I hadn't mentioned it, Mary said regretfully. I knew that there was some sort of sentiment attached to it, but... The old woman cut her off. Sentiment? Hate, you mean? She snapped. But maybe it's for the best. I'm an old woman, way past 70. I'm about due to die anyway. She stopped, her aged eyes taking on a faraway look. Maybe it's foreordained, she said, half to herself. He said that he'd be waiting for me. Maybe he is. Who knows? She rose from the table and took a step toward the door. I'll open it up in the morning and let it air out, she said. She moved up the stairway to the upper floor, her lips straight and tight. For a long time, Lucinda Marsh sat in the straight-backed chair beside her bed, her weary eyes gazing into vacancy while the panorama of the years unfolded itself. To her had come a great urge, a desire which she had kept in leash for close to half a century, the longing that comes to all murderers, a yearning to visit the scene of her crime. 1,000 times before, the same desire had swept over her, and she had always fought it off. Now, however, with the fulfillment of her wish only a few hours away, there had come to her a seeming need for haste. The closed room was calling to her. Within her brain a voice was shrieking, Now! Now! To her aged mind it was the voice of the man she hated, the man she had killed. Getting up, she went to the bureau and, opening the drawer, found the key where she had hidden it so many years before. She held it in her gnarled fingers, fondling it, crooning over it. Her room was at the head of the stairs. One by one, she heard the members of the household go to their rooms. Finally, the gloomy old house was filled with an indescribable quietness. Rising, she opened the door a tiny crack and peered out into the dark hallway. Satisfied that all were asleep, she picked up the small hand lamp and tiptoed furtively down the creaking stairs. A storm was in the air. She could hear the wind rising and shrieking through the branches of the trees. There was something reminiscent about the mournful wail. She stopped a moment, her head bent forward. Then remembrance swept over her. It was like this the night before he died, she muttered to herself. Her heart was beating a trifle faster as she reached the dark, grim door. She hesitated an instant. Then, transferring the lamp to her left hand, she inserted the key in the lock. It turned hard, as if reluctant to reveal the mysteries it hid. Then the tumbler shot back. For a moment she waited, her fingers on the knob. She was trembling now, shaking with an emotion she did not understand. "He said that he'd be waiting for me," she murmured. "I wonder if he is." She turned the knob and pushed against the panel. The aged hinges squeaked protestingly. Then the door swung open. A wave of malignancy and hatred surged over her. She stepped inside. Her lips closed in a tight, grim line. Just inside the door she waited, the lamp held high above her head, her eyes taking in every detail. There was the bed, unmade, where he had died. The thought came to her that Bill Reynolds, the undertaker, the last person to step foot in the room, was gone too. At the head of the bed was the little stand. On top of it was the glass in which she had administered the poison. Beside it was a bottle of medicine, half empty. The label, covered with old Doc Plummer's crabbed hieroglyphics, was yellow and faded. Doc Plummer. He too had been festering in his grave for years. There was the pillow where Obie's head had rested when he died. One corner was twisted, where he had held it when the last spasm of agony had knifed its way through his vitals. Nothing was changed. "He said that he'd be waiting for me," she said again. The room was musty and mildewed, the dust of years over everything. She closed the door and set the lamp upon the little stand. Going to the window, she pushed it up to its full length. The wind swept in, howling and shrieking. The lamp sputtered, causing queer, grotesque shadows to dance in the distant corners. Across the back of the chair where she had thrown it years before was the yellowed sheet with which she had smothered the dying breath out of her husband. There was a darker spot upon its mildewed surface. She knew it for the spittle that had drooled from his mouth. She moved to the center of the room, still peering furtively into the shadows. "He said that he'd come, back from the grave and be waiting for me," she said again and again. A fresh gust of wind howled through the window. The lamp sputtered, smoked, flared up, then went out. With the sudden darkness came a feeling of dread. For the first time in her life, Lucinda Marsh was afraid. Out of the darkness came a thing, a shapeless thing of white. For a moment it hung suspended in mid-air. It hovered over her, its long, shapeless arms reaching out for her. The wind shrieked with merry gusto. "Said that he'd be waiting," she murmured. It swept over her, holding her in its folds, twisting about her, smothering her. "God!" she shrieked, clawing at the enveloping tentacles. "He kept his word. He was waiting." In the morning they found her. Twisted about her head and throat was a yellowed sheet, the sheet with which she had smothered her husband. Clutching Hands of Death. John Hurst met death in the electric chair today. Standing on the brink of eternity, he refused to make any statement, maintaining the same enigmatical silence that had marked his demeanor from the day of his arrest. Those who followed the case will remember that I represented Hurst at the trial. There was little I could do, for he positively declined to allow me to put up any defense. From the very first he knew that he was doomed. In fact, he told me several times that he wanted to die. Yesterday I visited him for the last time, conveying to him the sad, to me, news that the governor had refused to grant a reprieve. He received the information with a smile. "You didn't think that he would, did you?" he asked. "But Nevertheless, I appreciate what you have done for me." He accompanied me to the cell door. Then, as we shook hands for the last time, he handed me a sealed envelope. "The truth is in this," he said. "When I am gone, give it to the press. Nobody will believe what I have written, but I, at least, have had the pleasure of putting it down without interference from—" He hesitated for the infinitesimal part of a second. "Never mind," he finally resumed. "It is all in there. I'd like my friends to know the whole damnable story." This morning, I sat beside the radio, waiting for the flash that told me John Hurst had gone to his maker. Then I opened the envelope. For a moment, the thought came over me that the man had gone insane. But as I reconstructed the crime for which he was executed, I realized that John Hurst was telling the truth. But the reader must be his own judge. The narrative follows. John Hurst's statement. This is not a war story, yet the horrible series of events which I am about to relate had their beginning in a base hospital somewhere in France. My last distinct recollection before that was the nightmarish, indescribable second when the captain held his hand aloft, his eyes glued on his wristwatch. He dropped his arm to indicate that the 0 hour had come. We went over the top, a scattered khaki line. I recall no more. I have a faint remembrance of jolting along in an ambulance on the way to the rear. I was sick, horribly sick, and weak. My arms felt numb, dead. I glanced down at them. My right hand was gone, evidently shattered by the premature explosion of the hand grenade I had been carrying when we went over the top. My left hand was so badly mangled that even I, a layman, could see that amputation would be necessary. I knew, too, that my chances for recovery were about 1 in 10,000. Nor did I care. I was reconciled to death when I thought of it, which was seldom. For most of the time I was unconscious. Some first aid man had bandaged me after a fashion, putting ligatures on my arms to halt the bleeding. I lacked the strength, or I would have pulled them off. For what man cares to go through life with 2 stumps for hands? I do not remember when I reached the hospital. My mind is a blank on many points. In fact, most of the events which I am about to relate happened while I was in a sort of trance. At other times I was in a sort of twilight sleep, catching indistinct snatches of conversation, but paying no attention to what was going on about me. 2 men were talking. "I've been wanting to do an operation like this ever since I quit school. Here's one that is made to order for me. Tell the nurse to get them ready." Both going, "Die." That's the point. But with such an operation, there's 1 chance in a million that the fellow whose hands are off will live. The other has no, will kill him. What's the odds? Matter of a few hours, one way or the other. The voices seemed to come from a great distance, yet I knew that the speakers were standing beside me. And for some reason, I knew that they were talking about me. I did not care. Then I drifted off again. I seemed to be floating through space. I was as light as a balloon. I realized suddenly that there was a smell of disinfectants in the air. I was sick to my stomach and sleepy. Oh, so sleepy. I managed to open my eyes, trying to recollect what had happened. Was it morning? Were we getting ready to go over the top again? Then my blurred vision made out the outlines of a clean, white bed, and I knew that I was in a hospital. I closed my weary eyes and dropped back to sleep. For some reason, I seemed to be the prize catch of the season from a medical standpoint. I was in a private ward, that much I realized, even though I was in a semi-stupor most of the time. The room was constantly filled with doctors and nurses. There was an almost incessant buzz of whispered conversation, through which I drifted drowsily. I know now what I did not know then, that I was kept under the influence of opiates. I think that I vaguely wondered why so much attention was being paid to me, a common sergeant. Yet I cared little. I was too ill, too weak even to speculate. Time had no value to me. For several weeks I must have hovered between life and death, realizing little. Then I took a turn for the better. This much I knew from the tone of the conversation. It was hard to realize that my hands were gone. I often imagined that I could feel the touch of the bandages against them. Yet something back in my subconscious mind told me that such was not the case. It was worse at night. It seemed at times as if someone were trying to seize my hands and drag them from me. Sometimes I woke up screaming, imagining that a wraith-like form was hovering over me. It was vague, indistinct. It always disappeared when I opened my eyes. The nurse was constantly outside the door. The touch of her cool fingers on my fevered brow usually quieted me. As I grew better, I cursed myself for a fool for allowing my imagination to run riot. I had heard stories of men who had lost their limbs and who, for weeks afterward, sometimes even for months, imagined at times that they were still in possession of their complete bodies. I remembered a tale my mother once told me of a boy who had had his fingers cut off in an accident, and who cried for days, asserting that his fingers were crossed. In desperation, a member of the family had finally dug up the buried digits and found that, in rattling around in the box before burial, they had become twisted. He had straightened them out, and the boy cried no more. So, as I say, as I began to regain my strength, I began to grow morose. I often wished for death. For who cares to go through life a helpless cripple? The day came when the young doctor, dropping in to dress my wounds, found me wide awake. The superintendent of nurses was with him. He greeted me with a smile and a cheery nod. I turned my head away as he unfastened the bandages. "Wonderful," he exclaimed with enthusiasm. "Look for yourself, Hurst." "I have no desire to gaze upon my helplessness," I answered bitterly. For an instant, he looked at me. Then realization swept over him. "God in heaven! Is it possible that you fail to understand that a miracle has been performed?" he demanded. "Turn your head, man. Turn your head and be prepared for a happy surprise." Something told me to do as he commanded. Where there had been but mangled stumps, there were now 2 hands. Big hands they were, horrible hands, the fingers stubby, muscular, the nails thick, the backs covered with coarse black hair. But they were hands nevertheless, my hands. Yet they were not my hands. My hands had been slender, the fingers spatulate. These were simian hands, the hands of a caveman. Yet when I tried them, I felt movement in them. I wriggled the fingers a trifle. I turned to the young doctor in astonishment. Was I dreaming? The victim of another hallucination? He sensed my bewilderment and hastened to explain. "The miracle of modern surgery," he said. "It is to be regretted that Colonel Ernest is not here to gaze upon the triumph of his skill. Unfortunately, he was transferred back to the States shortly after doing the work." I do not understand," I said thickly, gazing down at the stubby, ill-shaped hands, my hands, again. "It is the first time in history that such a grafting operation has been performed," he went on. "True, never before has a surgeon had the opportunity, for what man would give to another man his legs or his arms? But here the conditions were different. You were little better than dead, but the man in the cot beside you was worse, practically dying. Dr. Ernest took the one chance in a million. He removed the hands from the living man and grafted them onto your arms. He worked for hours, tying the muscles, the bones, together, and such was his skill that they knit. But Colonel Ernest is one of our greatest surgeons. This proves his skill. The other man? I asked. Naturally, he died. The young surgeon laughed. But he would have died anyway. For that matter, so would you. Out of what was left of two men, Dr. Ernest made one good body again. His name, poor devil? I asked weakly. The young doctor, a lieutenant, I think he was, shook his head. His identification tag was lost, he answered. He was a blooming Englishman, I think, but he was in French uniform. I am going to skip the years that followed. Naturally, it was hard to get used to the hands. The borrowed fingers were unskillful, clumsy, but I learned to use them as my own, acquiring a deftness that had been denied me at first. And so, as the flesh and muscles coordinated and became one entity, I almost forgot that they were not my own, except when I looked at them. Sometimes they made me shudder. They were cruel hands, it seemed to me, yet they were better far than no hands at all. But I could not entirely forget that they were borrowed. There was a vague, indefinable something that seemed wrong. At first I only sensed it. Then the feeling grew stronger and stronger, until I seemed to have it with me constantly. It was a sensation of being watched, of being spied upon. Time after time I caught myself turning suddenly, thinking that some alien presence was in the room. Little things were constantly coming up to intensify this feeling. Let me give one instance. Like most young men, I fell in love. The girl of my choice was visiting another city. I sat down to write to her. Naturally, my thoughts were of love, and it was of my love for her that I was writing. Having finished the letter, I was about to place it in the envelope to mail it before I went to bed, when something prompted me to glance over it. It was filled with profanities, vile things as unlike me as day is unlike the night. My hand had not obeyed the dictates of my brain. There were innumerable other instances of a similar nature. I began to notice that they always occurred at night. Then came the beginning of the end. It was in the middle of the night. I was sleeping dreamlessly, when suddenly I was awakened by a feeling of suffocation, of being throttled. Fingers were gripped about my throat, pressing against my windpipe. I breathed with difficulty. I was choking. I tried to raise my hands to defend myself. My arms were numb, useless. Across the bed I floundered. The pressure against my gullet increased. My tongue was protruding, my eyes bulging from their sockets. The room was, I believe that I have said, in darkness. The shades were up, and a vagrant moonbeam filtered through the window. In my struggles, I chanced to cross it. I saw my own hands pressing against my throat. I was choking myself to death. I shrieked with horror as I jerked my hands away from my throat. Yet it was a struggle. Something within me rebelled against it, told me to choke and choke and choke, until all of the breath had left my body. To almost every man there comes at least once in a lifetime that gripping, heart-stopping, blood-congealing sensation that we know as fear. It swept over me now, for a vague, indistinct form stood beside the bed. I tried to reach for the gun beneath my pillow. My laggard hands refused to obey the impulses of my brain. I could only lie there, the icy chills racing up and down my spinal column as that horrible, indescribable thing leered at me. It was a man. That much I could see in spite of the darkness. A tall man, broad-shouldered, his face flat and brutal. He glared at me with eyes filled with hatred and demoniacal fury. How do I know this? since the room was in darkness? I cannot answer that question. Perhaps I felt him, sensed him. I only know that I did see him distinctly, in spite of the blackness of the night. And I saw something else, even though it was but for an instant before he faded away. Where his hands should have been were only stumps. He held them up to my gaze. I shrieked again, for something seemed to link this thing, this wraith, with me. For a split second my brain raced like an engine robbed of its balance wheel. Yet in that infinitesimal passage of time, the whole truth was revealed to me. This was the man whose dying body had been robbed, desecrated, in order to provide me with hands. He was dead, yes, but part of him was still alive and attached to me. He was a part of me. I was keeping him lingering between this world and the next. He was dead and yet alive. My teeth were chattering as I forced my legs out of the bed and onto the floor. I reached for the light switch and pressed it. I spent the remainder of the night pacing the floor, my body bathed in cold perspiration. From that moment my body was, apparently, under the control of that fearful thing from beyond the veil. Yet I never saw him again, but I felt him, felt his presence constantly with me. I grew fearful of myself, sensing his deadly hatred of me. 100 times I caught myself in the act of killing myself. Caught myself, I say. Let me explain. My hands refused to do the bidding of my brain. They seemed endowed with an intelligence alien to mine. I threw my gun into the furnace when I woke up one night in the nick of time, finding my hands groping for it beneath the pillow. On another occasion my razor slipped. I jerked it away from my windpipe, knowing that I had been in the act of slitting my own throat. I allowed my beard to grow. My hands had assumed the mastery of my body, doing things constantly that were beyond my control. I grew morose and moody. Luckily, I was possessed of ample means, and my wants were few. Packing a few belongings into a trailer, I locked up my rooms, filled my car with books, and drove to a little place I owned 100 miles from the city. It was a hunting shack, surrounded by a few acres of ground in the midst, almost, of a wilderness. Here, my dog as my only companion, I intended fighting my battle with myself. Before leaving, I wrote a letter to the woman I loved, breaking off our engagement. I gave no reason, nor did I tell her where I was going. She replied, demanding an explanation of my strange conduct. I gave her none. And so, in the wilderness, the nearest neighbor miles away, I took up my residence. Fearful of having a sharp-edged weapon of any kind, I allowed my hair and beard to grow. It became long and matted. I was but a shadow of what I had once been. Even my dog sensed the change in me. In the daytime he was as he had always been, but at night, possessed of that strange sixth sense that is the birthright of the lower animals, he seemed to see beyond me, through me, if you will, catching glimpses of the hellish being that was always by my side. There is no other explanation for his conduct. Night after night he walked around me stiff-legged, his tail between his legs, his fangs bared, his hair bristling, a low, menacing growl issuing from his throat. Once I tried to pet him. He snapped at my hands. I never tried to pet him again at night. Yet in the sunlight he fawned on me, allowing me to caress him at will. Up to this time I was fearful only of myself. But, after a few weeks in the hunting shack, something happened which gave me new cause for alarm. I have said, I believe, that the community in which the shack was located was sparsely settled, the houses miles apart. Livestock roamed at will through the dark forests. One of the nearest neighbors, passing my place one day, stopped long enough to tell me of the death of one of his calves. "Not a mark of any kind on it," he said. "I found it back yonder a mile or two. Its mouth was open, its tongue lolling out, just as if it had choked to death, and its eyes were wide open and bulging, too." For the moment I thought nothing of it, but other farmers passing by during the days that followed told me of similar deaths among their livestock: calves, sheep, a hog or two. In every instance, death had resulted from the same cause. The open mouth and protruding eyes told their story only too well. Some monster was roaming the countryside, some fiend who killed for the love of killing. And still, I did not attribute this epidemic of death to myself. My nights were dreamless. I seemed to have got used to the strange thing that was haunting me, even though I spent my waking hours in worry. I was a mass of nerves. In spite of my excellent nights, I woke up each morning tired and weary. I put this down to my nervousness during the day. Then, one morning, I awoke to find my dog lying by the side of the bed, dead. His mouth was open, his eyes protruding. He had been choked to death. Realization swept over me. I proved the case against myself. The door and windows, all locked on the inside, had not been disturbed. My tired feeling each morning was plain to me now. I had killed the dog just as I had killed the calves and sheep that roamed the countryside. I was the monster for whom the farmers were searching. Instead of sleeping nights, I was in some sort of hypnotic trance brought on by the thing to which I was attached. My brain was master of my body by day, but by night my hands ruled my brain. I was spending the hours of the night wandering through the darkness in search of victims. I was a killer, a maniac. What was I to do? 1,000 plans went through my head while I buried my poor dog a little distance from the house. I rejected all of them. I should have given myself up, asked the officials to lock me up as a homicidal maniac. But something kept me from it, just as I was kept from killing myself. I tried 12 times to take my own life, but my hand was stayed each time. I could not understand it. Only a few weeks before, I was struggling with myself in an effort to avoid doing what I was now attempting to do. How was I to know that the foul fiend was keeping me alive in order to achieve a more subtle, more diabolical revenge? When I buried myself in the barren country, I had, so far as possible, cut myself off from civilization. I read but little. My few books sufficed me. Newspapers never passed my threshold. Why, I do not know, but I had never been a great reader of the daily press. Now it seemed as if I had taken a sudden aversion to every paper. I know now that it was the strange being that had taken possession of me, that he, hating the Fourth Estate for its exposure of him, had implanted this dislike in me. Thus it was that I did not know of the wave of death that was sweeping over the surrounding territory. Women, girls, innocent children were being killed, throttled to death by some hellish monster, as had been the calves and sheep. A score of detectives and county officials were scouring the country everywhere within a radius of 100 miles. And yet I went peacefully on to my doom, knowing nothing of all this. I took precautions, as I thought. I devised all sorts of little tricks to guard me against myself, little gadgets to wake me up in case I attempted to release myself from the complicated system of locks that I had constructed to keep me from wandering about in the strange amnesia which came with the setting of the sun. I did not realize that the cunning brain of the devilish thing from beyond the veil was clever enough to have me replace the traps before I lay down after one of my nocturnal excursions. Then, one morning, I woke up more weary than usual. I felt dull and lethargic. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The side of my face was bruised and blackened, as if from a blow. And still I did not realize the truth. I imagined that I had hurt myself while asleep. It was a few days later that, wandering through the woods a short distance from my humble shack, I had started for a neighboring brook after a mess of trout and had, for some reason, switched off. I chanced across a week-old paper, evidently dropped by some fisherman who had had it wrapped about his lunch. I was about to pass it by when a vagrant breath of wind blew it open. A picture stared up at me. I leaped back with a shriek of terror. It was the face of the handless monster who was now my master. I seized the paper, my eyes searching the glaring headlines that covered half of the front page. Does dead man live again? Is notorious London throttler alive in this country? Fingerprints of Bill Duxton, Newcastle Street slayer, found on vanity case of woman slain last night. Thought killed during World War. The paper told of the series of crimes that had shocked the entire civilized world. Women and children had been throttled, killed in cold blood by a fiend, a monster. Night after night, for 2 weeks, he had swooped down on villages and farmhouses, selecting his victims with maniacal cunning, never leaving a clue, until now. The night before the issuance of the paper, a crime of unusual atrocity had been committed. A young girl driving down a lonely country road had evidently run out of gas. At least, so the officials had deduced when the car was found a quarter of a mile from the scene of the crime, the tank empty. A stranger in that part of the country, she had apparently started out to walk to the nearest habitation for help when overtaken by the throttler. That she had battled desperately for her life was demonstrated by the trampled grass. Her mesh bag, open, its contents strewn about, was found beside the bruised and battered body, her dead fingers still gripping the chain. Upon the vanity case beside the open bag were the prints of a man's fingers. The officers had reconstructed the crime thus. The girl had been carrying the bag, womanlike, when attacked. She had swung it at her attacker. The blow had evidently forced the bag open. The monster, seizing it to jerk it away from the girl, had accidentally touched the vanity case, leaving his fingerprints on the clear, smooth surface. The case had been rushed to the city, and the fingerprints developed. While comparing them with the files of the police department, someone had accidentally stumbled upon a set of prints, yellow with age, of one Bill Duxton, a monster who had, a decade earlier, startled London with the ferocity of his crimes. The 2 sets of prints were identical. But Bill Duxton had disappeared at the beginning of the World War. It was believed that he had joined one of the armies fighting in France and had been killed somewhere at the front. The enterprising press photographer had taken pictures, both of the prints on the vanity case and those of Bill Duxton. They were displayed side by side on the front page beneath his picture. I had known fear before, but now I was to understand its full meaning. It was a chill autumn day, yet the beads of perspiration gathered across my forehead and trickled down into my eyes, for there was another picture on an inside page, the picture of the murdered girl. Even in death I recognized her. She was Joan Beresford, the woman I loved. I stuffed the paper in my pocket and ran back to my lonely shack like a thing accursed. The bruise on the side of my face was explained now. She had struck me there with the mesh bag. Like a man in a dream, I went to the table I used for a desk and, pressing my fingers against the ink pad, imprinted them upon a smooth piece of white paper. Then I compared them with those in the new sheet. All 3 sets were identical. Bill Duxton, the notorious London throttler, lived again in me. He was the man who, dying, had been hastened to his doom by the removal of his hands. A part of his flesh had been grafted to my flesh. He was a part of me. A surge of manhood swept over me. My flivver was standing in the yard. Hastening out to it, I measured the gas. The tank was almost empty, mute evidence of my foul deed, for the place where the crime had been committed was 40 miles away. I climbed under the wheel and stepped on the starter. My mind was made up. I would go to the city and give myself up. I looked at my wristwatch, knowing that I must hurry. It should be dark within an hour or 2, and with the coming of darkness, Bill Duxton would again be my master. And Bill Duxton, I knew, would not let me carry out my plans. The scourge of death must cease. It was growing dark when I turned off from the side road onto the pavement. Already I felt an almost overpowering desire to turn back. Bill Duxton was asserting himself. It was with difficulty that I kept my hands, his hands, from twisting the wheel and turning the car around. I pressed my foot a bit harder on the gas. There was a crash. Then oblivion. I awoke in a hospital. It was night time, for the lights were on. A nurse was bending over me, removing my blood-soaked clothing. She gave a sudden gasp at sight of the innumerable scars upon my torso. "For heaven's sake, look at this man, Dr. Ernest," she exclaimed. "His entire body is a mass of scars. And his arms, merciful heavens, the color of the hair upon them is different. A scar runs completely around them. It is as if the hands had been cut off and new ones fastened on." I heard an exclamation in a masculine voice. Then a man in a surgical garb bent over me. The same, he ejaculated. "I'd know that operation in a million. It's the man I was telling you about in class, Miss Miller. The grafting operation I performed in France. I often wondered if he lived." I gathered my strength. It was Bill Duxton and I working together now. My hands, Duxton's hands, leaped upward and seized him by his skinny throat. He tried to pull away. I clung to him as he dragged my battered body from the operating table. He dropped to the floor, his eyes bulging, his tongue protruding from his mouth. The nurse ran screaming from the room. A moment later, they were upon me. They tried to pull me off, but I hung on relentlessly, putting every ounce of strength I possessed into that throttling grip. "For Joan!" I gasped, digging my blunt fingers deeper into his gullet. When they pried me loose, he was dead. The Thing from the Grave. We had finished dinner and were enjoying a bottle of Judge Thompson's excellent old port in front of the big stone fireplace in the huge library. As is often the case when one has dined well, conversation had suddenly ceased, and for several minutes we sat smoking in silence, each of us occupied with his own thoughts. A deep sigh from the judge stirred me from my reverie, and I looked up with a start. His kindly face had taken on a drawn and haggard look. "Tired?" I demanded. Not particularly, he responded. Then, Dudley, I'll bet every penny I've got against a plug nickel that you can't guess what I was thinking about. Not taken, I smiled. It must have been serious, though, from the look on your face. Serious? Damned serious, he said slowly. I was wondering how long it would take me to choke you to death and whether your dying struggles would arouse the servants. I looked at him curiously. Your humor has taken a new angle tonight, I said somewhat stiffly. You surprise me. I'm going to surprise you still more, he interrupted. I invited you here tonight, Doctor, not altogether as a guest, but more particularly because of your experience as a psychiatrist. You have testified in my court a great many times. I recognize you as one of the world's greatest authorities on mental diseases. I want you to listen to me. I must talk to someone. He stopped suddenly. Leaning forward, he peered into my face as if wondering whether or not to continue. Then, as I nodded, he went on. It has taken me a long time to make up my mind to take this up with you. And now that you're here, I hardly know where to commence. At the beginning, I said sharply, putting on my best professional manner. Only by knowing everything can I diagnose your case. Again, there was a long, painful silence. Thompson slowly relighted his cigar and took a sip from the glass of port at his elbow. You psychologists tell us that every man has a phobia, a morbid dread of something, he said finally. Mine is the thought that eventually I shall kill somebody. Nonsense, I snapped. It may sound like nonsense to you, but to me it's plain reality, he growled. I was telling you the truth when I said a moment ago that I was thinking of murdering you. Murder! Murder! God in heaven, Doctor, the thing is never out of my thoughts. Day by day, call it obsession if you will, is growing on me. Within my brain, two ideas are constantly at war. One, urging me to throw aside these wild imaginings and be my normal self. The other telling me that I am the victim of metempsychosis, that I am no longer Joseph J. Thompson, the jurist, but Jake Loutz, the arch-killer, the man I sent to the chair a few months ago and who now is, or should be, festering in his grave. And may God have mercy on my soul. The latter thought is slowly but surely gaining the ascendancy. I want you to come to my office the first thing in the morning for a thorough physical examination, I said severely. You're overworked. Bosh, he interrupted. No judge is overworked, and to hell with your examination tomorrow. You're going to hear me out now, while I feel in the mood. Tomorrow, he shrugged his shoulders. Damn it, he continued. I've got to talk to somebody. Imagine if you can my mental condition. I'm not insane. I can diagnose my own condition well enough to make that statement positively. My nights are a succession of nightmares. I see myself taking life with my bare hands. I am throttling, stabbing, clubbing, shrieking with glee at the sight of the blood flowing from my victims. By day I sit in the security of my chambers and scan the newspaper accounts of every hellish crime, fearful that I will recognize some detail which will prove to me that my fearful imaginings are something more than dreams. Yes, and here is the worst of it all. I, who have always been one of the most kindly of men, am gradually longing to taste crime. Fight as hard as I will, I am constantly haunted by the desire to kill, to rend, to feel a human form grow limp beneath my throttling fingers. I gaze upon every man who is brought before me for trial and think of him as a potential victim. I envy the executioner who, for a paltry $100, pulls the switch which sends some poor wretch to eternity. I would gladly pay for the privilege of doing the job. What a satisfaction it would be to watch the dying struggles of a man strapped in the big black chair and no, that it was my hand that caused him to twitch and squirm and writhe as the hot current shot through his body. He arose and took a short turn about the room, his face twisted into a look of malignant ferocity. "Doctor, you've got to drive these hellish thoughts out of my mind," he exclaimed. "It's awful, horrible. Will you do it? Can you do it?" "Certainly," I responded gruffly. "Your nerves are unstrung. I will write a prescription shortly and send one of the servants to get it filled. Meanwhile, let me question you a bit. Sit down. You mentioned Jake Loutz. I remember him very well. I was one of the medical experts called in during the trial. Tell me where he fits into the case." Judge Thompson dropped wearily into his chair again and passed a trembling hand across his brow. "I'm beginning to wonder whether I am really myself or whether I am Jake Loutz," he said with a groan. "I have a feeling that I am possessed of a devil, the one that was in Jake Loutz before I ordered him electrocuted. There are spirits, you know," he went on earnestly, "that belong neither to heaven nor to hell. Perhaps they have escaped from the latter place. Be that as it may, these spirits must, in order to prolong their existence, seize upon the body of someone else when their abiding place is taken by death." "Nonsense," I snapped. "Rubbish and superstition. You've been listening to some old woman's tale." "Call it what you like," Thompson sighed. "I sentenced Jake Loutz to death, and standing in the courtroom, he shook his fist at me and swore to high heaven that he would come back from the grave in order to be revenged. I laughed at his threats and ordered the bailiffs to drag him from my presence. Dozens of other men have made similar statements, but Jake Loutz kept his word. Oh, hear me out," as I raised a protesting hand. "Then give me your opinion when I have finished. A few weeks after the execution of Jake Loutz, my wife and I attended a social function at the home of a friend. A part of the evening's entertainment was a spiritualistic demonstration. I will not bore you with the details. Suffice to say that, as usual, the room was in total darkness. We listened to ghostly voices and the like when, in the midst of a long-winded speech by one of the medium's so-called controls, the woman suddenly uttered a wild shriek. "The lights! The lights!" she screamed. Our host turned the switch and the room was once more bathed in light. "There is an alien presence here," she asserted. "I am a trumpet medium. My controls never materialize. Yet something touched against me in the darkness, something that was horrible, cold, and clammy, something direct from the grave. It must be that one of you is psychic, and that through you the materialization has been produced. I'm afraid to continue. My experience tells me that there are many, many things in the, shall I call it, between world, which are better left alone." There was a general demand that she continue, for her statement had naturally aroused our curiosity. I confess, however, that I considered the whole thing only a bit of flapdoodle put on to give us a thrill. A single glance at the woman's face told me different, however. She was genuinely frightened. She argued with us for a long time, and it was only when our host demanded that she either continue or receive no fee that she finally agreed. Again we took our places in the circle, and our host again turned off the lights. Almost immediately, a prickling sensation swept over me, a feeling of coldness and terror. It seemed as if I was alone in some vast cavern or charnel house. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it persisted. It was followed by a sort of lethargy. Yet I realized where I was and what was going on about me, and at the same time I was unable to move. I was numb, paralyzed. I can't describe how I felt. Only I know that I was scared. Great beads of perspiration gathered on my forehead and trickled slowly down over my cheeks. I tried to call out, but my lips were sealed. Then, out of the darkness appeared a vague cloud. It floated toward me, growing plainer and plainer, until it took on the shape of Jake Louts. He was different from what he had been in life, yet there was no mistaking him. He stopped just in front of me and crouched to spring. A vermin-grey, slouching figure, bestial, macabre. He was dead, that was plain to be seen. His face was bloodless and bloated, dotted with dark spots where decomposition had set in, and covered with the mould of the grave. His baleful eyes gleamed with a greenish-yellow phosphorescence. Piggish little eyes they were, filled with demoniac fury and bloodlust. He crept forward, almost on all fours, his blunt fingers working convulsively, his thick lips drawn back over his gangrenous fangs, a white, frothy slaver drooling from the corners. I tried to draw back, to shriek, but as I have already said, I was paralyzed. Suddenly he launched his great body at me. His fingers closed about my throat. They were cold and clammy, the fingers of a corpse. Something must have given the medium the power to see or feel. She screamed. God, how she screamed! Her shriek brought the others to their feet. Our host jerked the light switch just as I crashed backward beneath the weight of the ungodly thing. And when the lights came on, there was nothing, positively nothing there. The other guests crowded around us, plying us with questions. They could get nothing out of the medium. She was in hysterics and would not talk. As for myself, well, I didn't care to be taken for a fool, so I laughed the thing off. I told them that the affair had become boresome, and that I had dropped to sleep in the darkness and, losing my balance, had fallen backward. I could not, however, laugh off the horrible stench with which the room was filled. It was the smell of decomposition and death. Judge Thompson stopped suddenly. For a moment we sat there. I noticed that the sweat was pouring from his face and that his hand shook as he reached for the wine-glass at his elbow and drank deeply. I was frightened in spite of myself, yet I knew that he was merely suffering from hallucinations, that his nerves were shot to pieces. He got up and paced the floor with quick, agitated strides. I waited for him to gain control over himself. Again and again, during the next few days, I had the feeling of some alien presence close beside me. He resumed, sitting down again. You, perhaps, understand what I mean. You know how it is when you think someone is looking at you from behind. I tried my best to throw it off, but in vain. Then I was taken ill. You probably remember the time, although you were not called in. For days I tossed, mumbling and shrieking, my brain filled with weird, adumbral horrors. A consultation of physicians was held. They declared themselves baffled, but eventually I grew better until I was fully recovered. He leaned forward, his eyes blazing with excitement. I said that I was fully recovered, he resumed. Physically, yes. Mentally, what shall I say? Since that illness, I have never had that feeling of someone being near me. Instead, there commenced to creep over me this other sensation, this desire to kill, this phobia, if you want to call it that. Now do you understand? It was while I was sick, my brain filled with the maggots of fever, that the metempsychosis began to take place. Then it was that the devil that had been in Jake Louts started to take possession of me. Again he stopped. Then, Dudley, he said, in a slow, impressive voice, Jake Louts, dead though he is gradually gaining the control over my mentality. My subconscious mind tells me so. But why? Is it my body that he desires? I answer yes. His spirit has failed to find an abiding place, either in heaven or in hell, and to perpetuate itself it must, I say, seize upon some living person. Eventually, and the time is not far distant, I shall be Judge Thompson in name only. In reality, I shall be Jake Louts. And when that awful day finally arrives, I shall commit some foul crime. God, what a revenge that will be for him. I leaped to my feet. Judge Thompson, I said severely, this has gone far enough. I can enjoy a good yarn as much as anybody, but damn your pig-headedness, he roared, and glared at me balefully for an instant, as if tempted to leap at me. Then he dropped back against the cushions again, with a little sigh. I didn't expect you to believe me, he resumed, but as God is my witness, what I am telling you is the truth, or at least I believe it to be the truth. Now, will you permit me to finish? I granted assent and sank back into my seat. The man was either stark mad or else he was trying to play a gigantic hoax upon me. I knew Judge Thompson well enough to believe the latter, and as a cold-blooded, hard-headed man of science, I resented it. It's hell. Hell, I say, he went on. It is getting so that I measure with my mind's eye the rounded throats of little children when they climb upon my knee. I want to take them between my hands and squeeze until they are dead. Every nerve in my body twitches when I touch the warm flesh of the women with whom I dance. I've sent my wife away on an extended visit, lest I kill her while she sleeps. The thought has been with me a great deal of late. Night after night I have lain awake, fighting back the desire to creep into her room and throttle her. I'm afraid to trust myself alone with anyone. Right now my butler is standing outside the door. Why? Because I was fearful of being alone in here with you. I've issued instructions that there must always be 2 of my servants on duty at one time. They think that I am frightened because of the many threats that have been made against me. God, if they only knew. He picked up his dead cigar and relighted it. For a moment he puffed at it nervously, then laid it down again. Last night, he said slowly, something happened. At the beginning I told you that I was haunted by the thought that eventually I would commit some atrocious crime. I know now that the horrible things I have dreamed about are not dreams at all. I am a night prowler, Dudley, a slinking creature of the darkness, preying on what I may devour. I am a murderer, a fiend. Stepping to his desk, he picked up a copy of the Gazette and pointed to an article on the front page. The screaming headlines told of the murder of a young woman in an obscure part of town. Her throat had been torn, her head battered to a pulp. I killed that girl, he said slowly. I am certain of it, yet I cannot prove it. Can I go before any group of sane men and tell them that I know I killed a woman because I dreamed it? No. This morning when I woke up my hands were covered with blood. There were scratches on them. Perhaps you will say, the blood came from the scratches. How then did I get the scratches? And my shoes were muddy and soiled. Sometime during the night I must have gotten up and... Yet I have no recollection of murdering her, he ended piteously. I cannot swear that I am guilty, but I am guilty as hell. Then the lights went out. It was then that I knew the meaning of fear. Something swept over me that set every nerve to tingling. I was engulfed in terror. For an instant it seemed as if my heart stopped beating as I sat there in the dark. I heard a rasping chuckle, cold, demoniacal, cruel. 2 yellow eyes gleamed at me. "Judge!" I shrieked. "Judge Thompson!" My only answer was that throaty chuckle again. The eyes were drawing closer to me. It seemed as if I could see a form crouching to spring. I tried to move. Every faculty was paralyzed. Then it was upon me, a greenish, greyish horror with slavering jaws and red-rimmed bloodshot eyes. Its foul talons seized me by the throat. Then the lights came on. Wilkins, the butler, stood in the doorway. "Beg your pardon, sir, but a fuse blew out," he began. He stopped suddenly, his eyes fairly bulging from their sockets, his body stiffened, a look of horror creeping over his face. The judge, sir," he exclaimed. I turned. Judge Thompson still sat where he had been seated when the lights went out. He was dead, that much was apparent. Even as I gazed, the process of dissolution was going on with terrible speed. His eyes, wide open, were sinking far into their sockets. His face was mottled. The room was filled with a horrible stench. Together, Wilkins and I ran shrieking from the room. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time.